Welcome, everybody, to our program number 6 as part of our legislative series during this interesting and unique legislative session that is going on right now in Austin. So far, we've had 5 other programs in this series. We made a decision early on to switch from an in-person day at the state to a virtual legislative series, and it's worked out really well. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to Crystal Ratana with Children's Health. Children's is one of our sponsors this series, and Crystal's going to tell you a little bit more about the program and introduce our speakers. So Crystal, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, chamber members and guests. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Crystal Ratana. I am the Director of Community Relations for Children's Health, proud executive board member of North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, and Deputy Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Farmers Branch. On behalf of our board and our Public Policy Committee, I'd just like to formally welcome you all to part 6 of our North Dallas Chamber Legislative Series. As Jeff mentioned, due to the ongoing pandemic and the legislative visitation guidelines, we opted to replace our traditional day at the state with a virtual series featuring legislators, other elected officials, journalists, lobbyists, and others participating in the legislative session. This series, however, could not be possible without the support of our dedicated sponsors, AECOM, Bradley, Frost Bank, HDR, HNTB, Jacobs, Encore, Texas Health Resources, Reliant, Paul Sinelli, and of course, Children's Health. As many of y'all know, Children's Health is one of the largest and most prestigious pediatric healthcare providers in the country and the leading pediatric healthcare system in North Texas. The Children's Health System includes its flagship hospital, Children's Medical Center Dallas, as well as Children's Medical Center Plano, our Children's House, Inpatient Rehab Hospital, and the Children's Healthcare Network. Recently, however, Children's Health and UT Southwestern announced its first joint pediatric enterprise initiative at the reimagined Redbird development to broaden access in Southern Dallas to the region's top pediatric care. This project marks the first major collaborative initiative since the two organizations announced our joint pediatric enterprise in October of 2019. Through its academic affiliation with UT Southwestern Medical Center, Children's Health is a leader in life-changing treatments, innovative technology, and groundbreaking research. For this and many other reasons, we understand the importance of supporting academic institutions of higher education like UT Southwestern and the impact they have in our communities, which is why I'm so honored to introduce today's topic, higher education, and our guest speaker, Higher Education Commissioner, Dr. Harrison Keller. Now, a little bit about Dr. Keller. He, as you know, is the Commissioner of Higher Education for the state of Texas. He is a 6th-generation Texan with more than 2 decades of experience in educational budget and policy, digital learning, senior university administration, management, fundraising, and building effective coalitions among school districts, community college, universities, and the like. Dr. Keller's appointment as the 6th Commissioner of Higher Education and Chief Executive Officer for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board was effective on October 1st of 2019. He's a recognized innovator in policy and programs that improve college readiness, student access, especially in low-income and first-generation students. He came to the coordinating board from UT Austin, where he was deputy to the president of strategy and policy and a professor. He also served at UT Austin as vice provost of higher education policy research and executive director of the Office of Educational Innovation at the Center for Teaching and Learning. Prior to UT, Dr. Keller was director of research for the Texas House of Representatives and senior education advisor for the Speaker of the House. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy from University of Notre Dame and an MA and PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. He and his wife, Gina, live in Austin with their 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keller, and I will turn it over to you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you all. So I'm Harrison Keller, Commissioner of Higher Education, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. I'd like to share some updates about the current state of Texas higher education, tell you about some of our initiatives right now at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and also provide an update on some of the current discussions in the legislative session. And I know our time today is limited, and I want to make sure that we focus our conversation on the issues that are going to be especially of interest and useful to you all. So I'll talk for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then let's go ahead and switch to Q&A. So as you all know firsthand, this past year, our Texas students and families faced unprecedented challenges because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then it was only about 7 weeks ago that we also endured Winter Storm Uri. So just in February, we had campuses across the state that faced serious challenges with water and power, with food supplies. Most of our campuses were shut down, although they maintained food service for students on campus. And our campuses also, like everybody else, had problems with burst pipes and other issues in their dorms and other buildings. And that disruption came on top of the global pandemic that's been, of course, the most significant public health crisis that we faced in more than a century. So COVID-19 has already created massive costs for our colleges and universities in the hundreds of millions of dollars, not only with the cost of expanding their online instruction, their operations, moving students off campus last spring and setting up various mitigation strategies, testing centers on campus, but also especially last spring and over the summer with the simultaneous collapse of multiple revenue streams from their housing, their food service, events, athletics, and philanthropy. And I know we've got several higher education leaders on in the meeting today. And I want to say publicly, I commend our higher education leaders for their swift and creative actions over this past year. We stay in close and regular touch. And so I know, and although it often flies below the radar screen, about the ways that our college and university leaders, their faculty, their staff really stepped up to support community public health responses, make changes to keep people on safe on campus. And of course, through our research universities also develop new treatments and contribute to the development of vaccines that are already saving lives and enabling us to turn the tide on COVID-19. You may not know that 4 of the 5 most promising COVID-19 vaccines incorporate innovations and discoveries that happen right here in our Texas labs. So I've been emphasizing to our state policymakers that in moments of crisis, our colleges and universities have always been among our most important resources to help us recover and help us build for a better future. And as those campuses and as our communities across the state are transitioning from immediate response to recovery, I can also attest that our higher ed leaders recognize that they've got unique responsibilities and roles to play in accelerating our Texas recovery. Now, before the pandemic hit, I had been talking with the governor and with legislative leaders about how this session in 2021 was going to be a higher ed session, especially to complement the work that they did in 2019 that led up to House Bill 3 and billions of dollars that were invested in our public schools. And then, of course, the rug sort of got pulled out from under us this last March. And so now this session, of course, looks very different from what we anticipated, and but it's still a very important session for higher education. It's just some of the work that we anticipated being able to do this session is going to have to stretch across multiple sessions. So I've been making the case with our legislators, with the governor's office, that despite the disruptions we face, a strategic focus on and targeted investments in higher education are even more important today than before the pandemic, because our colleges and universities are the tip of the spear for our near-term recovery and our long-term economic competitiveness. They have the primary responsibility to develop the talent that's going to drive economic recovery for individual Texans, for our communities, and the state, so the state of Texas can emerge from this crisis with an even more resilient and highly skilled workforce. Now, one powerful example of the kind of strategic investments that I'm talking about was represented in $175 million in discretionary federal CARES Act funding that was allocated for higher education last year. So many of the major things that we've been able to do through the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to support our students, support our institutions, were because of this commitment by our House and Senate leadership and by Governor Abbott. The vast majority of these funds were dedicated to student financial aid, and that included $57 million to protect our need-based financial aid programs from coronavirus-related budget cuts, and then another $46.5 million for emergency financial aid for students who were already adversely affected by the pandemic. What we were seeing in the fall is tens of thousands of students that were having trouble paying their bills and in danger of disenrolling, of stopping out. And so we were able to work closely with the institutions and within days distribute millions of dollars across the state that directly serve tens of thousands of students to help keep them enrolled, help keep them on track to earning their credentials. Then there was another $46.5 million that was allocated to help Texans who have some college credit but no credential, and also to help Texas workers who need to reskill and upskill with short-term workforce credentials so they can get back on their feet, rejoin the workforce, and help drive the recovery of the state economy. The remaining funds from the CARES Act are supporting two major initiatives through our agency. So first, we're leading a major project to modernize our educational and workforce data infrastructure. So you may not know that the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is charged in statute to be the steward of our state's combined educational and workforce data infrastructure. And that includes rich data from school districts and colleges, universities, state agencies, and national partners. And so we've organized this data modernization project with the Governor's Tri-Agency Initiative, with our partners at the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Workforce Commission, along with our higher education institutions and other stakeholders, with a primary focus on making this data more useful and accessible. We have incredibly rich data in Texas. We just haven't always done a good job of turning that into actionable intelligence and information for students and their families, for institutions, for other stakeholders, and for policymakers. So the new infrastructure that we're working on right now and going to be rolling out over the next several months will include interactive advising tools so students can find and compare different educational programs and training opportunities, view potential costs and earnings, and also connect directly with post-secondary programs, and also provide near real-time access to information for policymakers to help inform their decisions. The second initiative that we're leading is around bolstering the quality of digital learning. So we've stood up a new team within the coordinating board led by a new assistant commissioner of digital learning. And through that team, we're rolling out two strands of work. So first, working with our institutions to get behind, support our faculty innovators in the development or redesign of course materials that use open educational resources. So those are resources that are adaptable by faculty and also available at no cost to students. And we're working on these in three areas. So around college readiness materials, around course materials for frequently transferred core courses, and also around workforce education materials. And I don't know if he's still on, Joe May was on here earlier. Dallas College is a close partner with us in providing technical assistance to other campuses, especially around the development of high quality workforce education materials. And I appreciate Joe and his team partnering with us. We're also around digital learning, working in close partnership with centers for teaching and learning across the state and also the digital learning support centers on campuses to stand up a new digital learning clearinghouse with curated resources that can easily be shared and customized for institutions and their faculty. Because what we saw is that as everyone was forced to put their courses online this last spring, so we had the teaching support centers, the digital learning centers on campuses that may have been supporting a few dozen courses, maybe in some cases a few hundred courses before, all of a sudden overnight had to support thousands of courses. And so there are some terrific resources that have been developed on individual campuses or that they found are useful when they're working with their faculty or working with the campuses to make that kind of information much more readily shareable across campuses. Now, Texas is only one of a handful, among a handful of states that have used these discretionary federal stimulus funds for these kinds of strategic investments in higher education. And so in particular, this decision from the governor, the legislative leadership, to leverage federal dollars to protect financial aid, to provide emergency aid to students who are at risk of dropping out, provide support for people who need to reskill and upskill, it's already making a real difference for tens of thousands of Texans across the state. Now, of course, there are still significant needs, especially related to student financial aid. And so throughout the current session, we're going to continue to advocate strongly in Austin and in Washington for smart strategic investments and of both state and federal dollars for higher education. Now, you might get I've already gotten the sense there is a lot going on right now around higher education policy, around the coordinating board. I'll talk a little bit more about the session, but first, I'd like to share updates on three initiatives that might especially be of interest to you and your colleagues that are also intersecting with some of our some of the discussions at the session. So first, I'd like to share some of the work that we're doing right now to strengthen and refine our state's long-range strategic plan for higher education, which is called 60 by 30 Texas. So the 60 by 30 Texas strategic plan was unveiled in 2015 as the roadmap for Texas higher education. And the central goal is to increase the number of younger Texans who have degrees or certificates so that by the year 2030, 60% of Texans aged 25 to 34 would have earned some kind of post-secondary credential. So the 60 by 30 Texas plan was designed to ensure that Texas would meet changing job demands and remain highly competitive in national and global economies. Since then, we've made good progress across most of the 60 by 30 Texas goals. And while that central intent of the plan remains critically important, it's become evident, especially over this last year, that we're going to need to update that plan to meet the needs of Texas today and for the next decade. In particular, we all know that the pandemic has shaken our economy and created massive job losses. So millions of Texans filed unemployment claims over this past year, and we still have hundreds of thousands of Texans who are going to need to reskill and upskill to be able to get back into the workforce, get back on their feet, and help drive our state's recovery. Again, our colleges and universities have the primary responsibility to develop that talent that's going to drive that economic recovery for those individual Texans, for our communities, and for our state, so we can emerge from this crisis with an even more resilient and highly skilled workforce. So how are we going to make sure that our state goals are aligned with what we need from Texas higher education now? We've undertaken this work with the support of a steering committee that's composed of board members, appointed board members from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and also the Texas Higher Education Foundation Board, which is a partner 501c3 with the coordinating board. And then we're actively seeking input from stakeholders across the state, including higher education, K-12, and important, and especially from the business community, so we can make sure that the measures and the targets of our plan are going to keep a strong focus on the workforce needs of our state. So specifically, we want our refined plan to include 4 key priority areas. First, more attention to leveraging and accelerating innovation to drive new discoveries, economic development, prosperity for our regions and our state. Second, expanding the focus of the plan to include more attention to the needs of adult learners, especially those Texans that need to reskill and upskill. Third, prioritizing high-value credentials, not just saying generically we want to increase educational attainment, but what are the credentials that align with current and future job opportunities? And finally, being intentional in our commitment to equity so we can ensure that all Texans have equitable access to the information and resources they need so all Texans can participate in, contribute to, and benefit from our economic recovery. In these past several weeks, we've held a series of 9 virtual listening tours with stakeholders that were co-hosted by colleges and universities. So far, we've engaged nearly 500 community leaders across the state in these conversations. And the next steps are going to include additional listening sessions and focus groups with the business community across Texas and a statewide convening later this spring. So we're very excited about this work to help focus our state's higher education resources so we can help build a more resilient economy and an even better Texas future. Next, I wanted to highlight some of the work that the coordinating board's doing in partnership with TEA and the Workforce Commission as part of Governor Abbott's Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative. So the governor established the Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative in 2015 to develop stronger connections between education and industry with the goal of helping Texas grow in economic prosperity. And shortly after I became commissioner, the governor's office worked closely with the chief executives across the 3 agencies to renew the charges to the Tri-Agency Initiative and encourage even closer collaboration. In my view and my experience, the Tri-Agency Initiative, the work we've developed together, especially over this past year, has been very productive, and on a number of fronts, it's enabled us to move faster and more effectively in our response to current challenges, especially due to COVID-19. So our vision for the state is that all Texans should have access to high quality educational and training opportunities that are going to empower them to achieve their full potential. And we hope to achieve the vision by building a strong Texas workforce, strong Texas talent pipeline, and ensuring that Texans are going to be prepared for jobs in the industries that are going to power the state's economy today and into the future. And we're working together across multiple fronts to identify ways that we can move students effectively and efficiently through our educational pipelines with a better sense of alignment with the workforce needs across the state. And again, this work is designed to build on the work that was done in House Bill 3 from the 2019 legislative session, which infused billions of additional dollars into our public schools, especially to increase our college and career outcomes for Texas students. And then finally, on behalf of the Tri-Agency Initiative, the Coordinating Board is taking the lead on a statewide effort in partnership with institutions of higher education, school districts, employers, and also state and national organizations to innovate and strengthen college and career advising. So one of the limiting factors in our Texas students' educational and career pathways has been access to high quality advising. So one issue is that students traditionally get access to advising when they're already enrolled in institutions, but a growing number of our students take courses across multiple institutions. And also many students, especially students whose parents don't have post-secondary credentials, just aren't aware of the full range of options that are available to them. So our aim is to ensure that all Texas students from middle school through adult learners are going to have access to high quality college and career advising, including well-designed digital resources and well-trained counselors and advisors. So those resources include curated information for students and their families, virtual advising tools, an improved and larger scale artificial intelligence chatbot, which we call ADVI, that can text personalized reminders and guidance to students, new data dashboards for advisors and institutional leaders, and also an expanded version of the Texas On-Course Digital Academy with extensive just-in-time training and support for counselors and advisors across the state, from secondary schools through our post-secondary schools and even into the local workforce boards. Now, this work is ambitious and it's already underway. So we're already working closely with higher education institutions and with our school districts. We're texting with more than 150,000 high school seniors across the state right now, and more than 16,000 counselors and college advisors who advise more than 95% of the secondary students across the state are already connected back to us through the Texas On-Course Academy. Through our GradTex initiative, we're also working closely with higher education institutions and with the Greater Houston Partnership to curate and incubate new advising resources and a marketing campaign for adults that have some college and no credentials. So that work's going to be rolling out in the next month in pilot, with the aim of rapidly scaling in partnership with institutions and employers across the state. I'm passionate about this work, and I'm convinced that this work to support high quality college and career advising is at scale is going to be absolutely essential for Texas to realize our ambitions for student success, accelerate our economic recovery, and again, provide the kind of resilient and highly competitive Texas workforce that our future will demand. And this is going to continue to be a major priority for us at the coordinating board and continues to be an important topic of discussion in the current legislative session. Now, as you all know, the 87th legislative session is well underway. In fact, there's only 55 days remaining in the session. Since my first day on the job, I've made it a priority to reorganize our agency around a commitment to serving as a more effective and efficient resource and a credible partner with our policymakers and with our institutions. So in particular, one important change is that the coordinating board hasn't proposed our own legislative agenda. So throughout the session and beyond, our role is to provide the resources and information that our state policymakers need and our institutions need to help inform their deliberations and their decisions. In particular, state appropriations discussions are ongoing, and those have been very complicated this year because of some confusion around what kind of federal funds are available, what kinds of strings are attached to those federal funds, and trying to put that in the context of a very tight state budget. So the full Senate is expected to take up its state budget bill this week, and then the House will follow suit in the coming weeks. Now, I mentioned earlier about student financial aid, and funding for our state's major need-based financial aid programs remains critically important if I were going to pick the number one thing that keeps me up at night, it would be state financial aid, to make sure that the resources are going to be there to help keep students enrolled, help keep students on track. And I'm happy to report that right now, both the House and Senate committees both recommended restoring the 5% reductions that had been made due to coronavirus to these programs. That's about a $57 million commitment, both by the House and the Senate committees. And the House also included our requested $110 million increase to maintain the current proportion of eligible students who are served by these programs. I'm sure that student financial aid is going to continue to be an important point of discussion as they go into their conference committee negotiations. There's still going to be a lot of work to do before the budget's finalized, but I'm continuing to make the case along with our higher education institutions and with our partners in the business community for the importance of funding for higher education to our state's economy. Now, on the legislative side, both House and Senate have started now to get into a regular rhythm of committee hearings. It was a little slower out of the blocks than usual, and they're considering bills on a number of different issues, including student transfer, institutional course offerings, digital textbooks, among other issues. So our agency is closely monitoring all the legislation that impacts higher education. And again, we'll continue to communicate, partner closely with legislators and with our higher ed institutions as the session progresses, so we can help them make the best decisions for our students and our institutions and our state. So just to wrap up, I want to emphasize, I think it's important to acknowledge the magnitude of the challenges we've been facing. And these past 12 months have presented the most significant challenges and greatest disruptions to the operations of our Texas colleges and universities that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. And our students and our Texas higher ed institutions continue to face unprecedented challenges. There's still a lot of hard work ahead of us. But I have to say that I remain encouraged and inspired by the opportunities that lay ahead. We're building on the work we've already begun, and through stronger collaborations among our colleges, our universities, employers, and state agencies. And in these collaborations and investments to better support our students, through the hard work of committed educators and with stronger partnerships with employers, I'm confident that we can build a more resilient economy and aspire to even higher goals. So all Texans will have opportunities to participate in, benefit from, and contribute to an even better Texas future. Thank you all again for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion, and I'm looking forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keller. We really appreciate that update. It's great to have leaders like you participate at these and give us an update on what's happening from your perspective relative to the session. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions. And then, of course, we do want this to be interactive. So if you've got a question for Dr. Keller, go ahead and post it in the chat or send it to me privately. If you've attended our programs before, you know that we like to call on people to ask the questions that they pose. So don't be shy. Go ahead and put them in the chat if you've got questions for Dr. Keller. But let me get us started. Dr. Keller, you mentioned that you had thought that this might be a higher education session. Certainly some of that has changed due to COVID and the ice storm and other issues that pop up as things do. But tell us in detail, some more detail, what are some of the bills that your office has been tracking in this current session?
Well, for this session, number one with a bullet is around appropriations, right? Because it's been the COVID-19 pandemic, the ice storms, the crisis in global energy markets, and we've had multiple black swans, and they've hit our state and especially certain regions of our state incredibly hard. So we were all bracing for what the revenue estimate might look like. Frankly, it came out a lot better than a lot of us expected it might be. I think the comptroller does a great job, and his team do a great job in taking a hard look at the data. But of course, these are incredibly dynamic times. So I don't envy their job in trying to do the revenue forecast. And then on top of that, we've had 3 different rounds of infusions of federal funds, and on the higher education side, that's been a little different than on the public education side. So on the public education side, The stimulus funds have gone through the Texas Education Agency. That's important on a couple of fronts. So as it goes through the agency, then there's a portion of the funds that can be used strategically for state purposes, and it's easier for the state to make sure that the distribution of funds to school districts is aligned with state priorities. On the higher ed, it doesn't work that way. So on the higher ed side, the department basically drives funds directly to the higher ed institutions, not through the state. They use their own distribution formulas that, frankly, they don't consult with us at all as they're devising those. And so it's much harder to coordinate what's going on around the allocation of those funds or the use of those funds. And so that's where I want to say I think it was important that the first allocation of the more discretionary funds for education from the governor's office was for higher education, to make some strategic targeted investments where we were seeing issues with our students. So there's still a lot of confusion around some of the federal funds. I know I spend a lot of time talking with our chancellors and presidents, and we're still trying to get questions answered about the funds that came in December, and then there's the most recent allocation of federal funds on top of that. But I will say, I think for this next 2 years, one of the most important kind of opportunities and challenges for us in Texas and across the United States is going to be how we make sure that these allocations of one-time funds to institutions and to states are used well, are used strategically, so we can come out of this stronger. So this is not a time just to hunker down and backfill and hope that things get back to normal. I don't anticipate that things are ever really going back to the kind of normal that we expected a couple of years ago. So again, number one issue and the most important area of focus for us is really around appropriations.
Thanks, Dr. Keller. And you mentioned sort of this return to normal and what that will look like. And it reminds me of our education forum last year, and we heard from Dr. May with Dallas College and others about the return of investment on higher education, particularly as it relates to online learning arising out of COVID. What do you see as the future of higher education as it relates to online learning and some of the challenges that we've had over the last year and a half?
Yeah, so there's both sort of short-term and longer-term challenges and opportunities, right? So what we had was not just individual faculty, but whole departments, whole institutions that really had sort of opted out of doing very much with digital learning, that all of a sudden found themselves thrust into it last March. So if we were having this conversation just a little over a year ago, and I said something like, well, I think all of our institutions would be able to put almost all their courses online in about 2 weeks. Well, then everybody would have thought I was crazy. But that's actually what happened. That's what they did. It was really amazing. Now, let's stipulate that there's an important distinction between emergency online instruction and high quality digital learning, right? So when everybody's sort of rushing to put their courses and convert their operations to online, like sometimes the technology doesn't always work, and sometimes the design of the course doesn't translate as well to online delivery, and so there's been a lot of bumps along the road. But I will say this: what we've also seen across our state and across the nation is that as the creative energies of our faculty and our students have been channeled in new directions, there's also a lot of really exciting things that are happening. So institutions, departments, they're making changes in their program designs and their course designs. They're breaking 3-credit courses into a series of 1-credit courses, or compressing labs from a 15-week semester into an intensive 2-week experience for students. They're incorporating technologies in lots of new ways, so that faculty who before had no interest in digital learning now are saying, I'm never going back. And what they mean is that they're not saying, I'm never going back to teaching face-to-face. That means that they've discovered new ways to leverage the technology to make teaching and learning more effective. And so it feels like we're just at the front edge of this historic transformation in higher education. And now that's, again, for the longer term, going to present enormous opportunities, also enormous challenges. And so we've got to build different kind of infrastructure, different kind of support structures within our campuses. We're using our physical spaces differently. We don't need as many auditoriums as we did before, that kind of thing. But we need digital studios, or we need more modular lab spaces, that kind of thing. So the conversion is going to still take a lot of investment and a lot of work for us to be able to pull off. But I have to say, I'm very excited about the potential and the creativity around this work that I'm seeing.
Great. We're excited too. And thanks for that update. Last question from me before we turn it over to questions from others in the audience. Early in the series, you referenced Comptroller Glenn Hagar, and we heard from him earlier in this legislative series. In fact, he was the first speaker that kicked off this program for us back in January. He was pretty optimistic about the budget, I think more than any of us had expected him to be. But of course, there's still concern about revenue shortfall and how that impacts a variety of things. And so want to get your sense on how is that impacting higher education?
So in several ways, I mean, the folks who are working on the budget are very conscious about not wanting to create funding cliffs. And so even where there's one-time federal funding that's come in, that creates the opportunity for some short-term investments in higher education. But if, for example, like when we talk about investments in financial aid, one of the things I appreciate around that is from both the House and the Senate budget folks, they see that more as a recurring commitment. They see that more as a recurring expense. But there are other things that we can do to help, for example, around the retooling of some of our spaces, or some other one-time needs where you can make sort of smart investments to stand up new kind of digital infrastructure and new advising tools, some of the other kinds of things that I'd referenced before. Also, you can make investments put seed capital out there, for example, to stand up new kinds of workforce education programs that align better with the kinds of job opportunities that are out there now and going to be important in the near term. So that's the most important thing that I'd flag is I think there's a little more of an orientation to what we could do with one-time money and how we use the one-time money well. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have the recurring costs. It just means that we'd anticipated being more in a conversation about how we would do some more fundamental restructuring around higher education finance that would be more on the kind of recurring side of the budget. That's going to take, I think, multiple sessions for us to achieve now. This is work we're still committed to supporting. It's just going to have to happen on a different timetable than we were hoping for.
Great. Thanks very much. First question is from Dan Hooper with ScholarShot. Dan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Jeff. Commissioner Keller, thank you so much for pushing to reinstate the Texas grant and particularly increase that. The kids we see desperately need that. So thanks for that, just as a comment. Question for you relates to the tri-agencies, the Higher Education Coordinating Board, the TEA, and the Texas Workforce. And a piece of legislation that's promoted by Texas 2036 and Commit, it's Senate Bill 1622 and House Bill 3767, which intends to put a little more credibility, accountability, and visibility across the three agencies. I'm just curious, are you in favor of that? What do the other commissioners think? And one point of order along that line of questioning is, the latest data shows that only 29% of all the Texas high school graduates earn anything after high school. The high schools all say, look, we did our job, we got them to graduate. The universities and colleges say, well, it's not our fault, they weren't ready for college. And the Workforce Commission is saying we desperately need kids ready and certified to go to work. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on those pieces of legislation and what the other commissioners think about that.
Well, I'll take your second point first, Dan, and it's great to see you. I appreciate the work that you do. So, first of all, we absolutely need to do a far better job in educating more Texans to higher standards than we've ever achieved before. So before COVID hit, we were actually gradually slipping each year in terms of our shares of high school students that enrolled directly in college after high school, and this is concerning across multiple fronts, right? So, especially concerning now when we've seen like dramatically lower rates of enrollment, transfer, student persistence, especially for low-income students, for Black students, for Hispanic students. This isn't a short-term crisis. This is a strategic vulnerability for the state that we've got to engage on much more seriously. And we need to do that both for those traditional age students to facilitate their transitions from secondary into post-secondary education. But as I mentioned before, we've got hundreds of thousands of Texans who are going to need to reskill and upskill to get back on their feet. So there's in Texas, we've done some surveys of the Texans with some college and no credential. And what we see there, and also we see in similar national surveys, is about a third of the respondents will tell you that if they lose their job, they would need additional education and training to get another job in the same industry. And then about a third of the respondents would say if they lost their job, they believe they'd need more education and training because they would have to change career paths and they'd have to get a job in a new industry. So folks understand that they're going to need additional education and training, but there's still a lot of anxiety about the risk of taking on of enrolling and completing more education. So folks will also say they're worried about having childcare. They're worried about what are the relevance of those programs to new kinds of job opportunities. They're worried about whether the program would be offered in a way that would be flexible and maybe consistent with their work schedules, that kind of thing. So we've got to, this is a problem that we're going to have to tackle much more seriously at a much larger scale than we've ever achieved before. And we've got to do it in a way that's really sensitive to the needs of adult learners and how that support is different. So on particular pieces of legislation, I'm trying to be careful that I'm not publicly declaring like I'm for or against. I'm always testifying on pieces of legislation. I will say this: we've been over the last, especially over the last year and a half that I've been commissioner, I've been working very closely, very productively with Mike Morath at TEA, with Brian Daniel and his colleagues at the Texas Workforce Commission. I think if we had not laid that groundwork in the tri-agency workforce initiative, there's a lot that would have been a lot harder as we were working on our COVID response. And so both formally and informally, I appreciate the strong collaborations that we've built already across the agencies. So there's a lot that we've already launched. There's a lot that's already ongoing, and I'm enthusiastic about that partnership.
Thanks, Dr. Keller. Thanks, Dan, for that question. Next question is from Cece Gassner with Texas A&M Commerce. Hi, Cece.
Hi, Jeff, and hi, Dr. Keller. Thank you for being with us. I know that it has only been a few months since that first round of the reskilling, upskilling grants was distributed. And full disclosure, we were part of a consortium that did receive some of the funding. My colleagues have just been telling me here and there about some really good stories of students that were helped, but I didn't know if your office had even had time yet to start getting any data in or other anecdotes to talk about the impact the grants have had. Yeah,
so we've been work closely with the institutions on reporting requirements for that, because we do want to have a sense of how the funds are being used. really appreciate the partnership with Commerce on multiple fronts, including the reskilling grants. So just for everybody else, the way it worked is it was unusual, not just for Texas, but across the nation, is we had some dollars that were committed for financial aid for folks who have some college and no credential, but they're close, folks who are in striking distance, or for displaced workers who need to reskill and upskill to be able to get back on their feet. It's because even a short-term workforce credential can make all the difference in the world for somebody to be able to get back on their feet, get back in the workforce. And so the idea was to provide some financial aid, because there's generally not much financial aid available, especially around workforce education or short-term workforce programs, make that available to the institutions. But for the institutions, what we ask them to do is to commit to using these programs, or using the financial aid either for programs that were aligned with the critical needs that have been identified in the priority occupations list by the local workforce boards or the Workforce Commission, or to work in partnership with the Workforce Board and local employers to align with their needs. And so a lot of flexibility there, but with the intent clearly around making sure that those dollars are going to be able to be used in a way that would be aligned with local workforce needs. And we also partnered with Workforce Commission and with a national partner to put a tool together for institutions so they could see the best available data on the unemployment filings, projections, also about types of occupations expected to grow by region, and to get a sense of how the demand out there in their regions might relate to the current future workforce needs. So anyway, we've distributed so far, I think about $27 million has gone out to support students, with tens of thousands of students who are taking advantage of this. And again, I really appreciate the institutions coming together, working in consortia and partnership with each other, and also directly with employers to make more of those opportunities available. This is an area that I think we need to continue to lean into to make sure that we're expanding opportunities for folks to reskill and upskill so that we can accelerate our recovery of our Texas economy.
Thanks, Cece, for that question. Next question is from Dr. John Grabarczyk from the University of Phoenix. Dr. G?
Thanks, Jeff. Dr. Keller, you were mentioning, the rate of high school students going into college. And last week, we in the North Dallas Chamber had a presentation where the organization United to Educate was talking about putting college banners in elementary schools. And they were talking about how inspirational that was to these young children. And I was just wondering, that just seemed like a really great idea. Of course, I understand how many elementary schools there are in the state of Texas, but it just seems like if we could maybe encourage that, and maybe because there's so many elementary, maybe at least in middle schools. And certainly I know high schools, I work in high schools, I see a lot of banners for colleges. So I think the high schools are covered. But if we could do something a little lower in the education structure to put just the college reinforcement every day to go, Texas Tech or UT, et cetera. Just a thought.
No, I appreciate your bringing that up. And actually, it's funny you bring that up today, because just earlier today, it was a conversation about how do we extend some of our resources for college and career advising to reach down more to, not just to sixth grade, but third grade. And so that is an area of work I'm enthusiastic about. We have an infrastructure that we've already created for, as I mentioned earlier, for training and supporting college and career counselors and for getting information out. So we have through our On-Course Academy, so there's more than 16,000 college and career advisors from middle schools and high schools who are able to get sort of just-in-time training and access to resources. We've not yet worked on extending that down into elementary schools. I have to say, as a dad of an elementary school kid, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great proposal, and I'm enthusiastic about it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. G. Last question I think we have time for is from Ken Malcolmson. Ken, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Ken, you're on mute.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Keller, for being here today. Great presentation and really appreciate what y'all are doing. A couple of quick questions for you. So you talked about collaboration with the other agencies, like with Mike Morath, et cetera. You also obviously collaborate with organizations like Texas 2036, who have great research capabilities. But when we take that collaboration further, how do you feel about public-private partnerships? And how does your agency collaborate with private and for-profit institutions?
I guess for public-private partnerships, I mean, I guess in some ways we're already involved in a number of them on multiple fronts. I think is going to be important for us. With the right kind of protections around things like data security, for example, we're enthusiastic about strategic partnerships. So, for example, like in the work that we're doing on data infrastructure, that's multifaceted. So we've got work that we're doing on the technical architecture. We've got work that we're doing on governance, in close partnership with the Tri-Agency Initiative. We also, though, have a number of strategic partnerships. So we don't want to wait for new infrastructure to be developed to be able to put tools and actionable information out there for the institutions. So that's a particular area where we have a number of different partnerships with university systems, with universities, with private nonprofits, and we've commissioned other kinds of analyses so that we can get tools out there faster, get information out there faster to the institutions. And that also helps us learn a lot about what are the functional requirements going to be, so that we can, so as we stand up new infrastructure, we don't just want to build pretty dashboards and pretty charts. There are plenty of those that nobody has time to use. You want to make sure that you can provide information in a way that's really tailored to the way people make decisions. And so these kinds of strategic partnerships are invaluable for us in understanding how people use data, how people use information, how they make decisions. It's a sort of longer conversation, but in general, I'd have to say that I think strategic partnerships and networks of different kinds of partners from employers, from industry, from higher education, from state agencies. That's more the wave of the future for us to do that, powered by the technology and the kind of data infrastructure that we need so that we can move faster.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, very much. I think we've got time for one other quick question, so I'll use that to ask a real quick one. Dr. Keller, you talked about HB3 and how transformative that was for public education in the state of Texas. Talk about how that's looking ahead for the future, how that's impacting higher ed, and what you're seeing there.
Well, I think the one of the most important things for higher education for the nearer term is going to be that HB3 focused more of the K-12 attention on college, career, and military readiness. And one of the things I especially appreciate about my colleague Mike Morath is he put a marker down early that K-12 shouldn't try to stipulate that for higher education. A reputation as a little bit of a data wonk. So, I think a lot of these are empirical questions, whether students are really ready to do the next thing. And it should be not just because we say so, but because we look. Like, what are the kinds of things that students need to know and be able to do, so they're going to be more likely to be able to navigate the next step. And that will vary depending on what kind of programs they're in, what kind of institutions they're in. We need to make that more transparent for students and for the institutions. And so that's a particular area of work that I think Texas is going to be well poised, better than a lot of states, to move faster and further. because of that strategic focus and clarity around college, career, and military readiness. The other thing is that we now have one of the most equitable public school finance systems in the nation. So HB3 infused billions of dollars into public education and was really a historic investment. Then if you look at our higher education finance systems, both for general academics and for community colleges, it stands in pretty stark contrast. So when we were talking about 2021 originally going to be a higher education session, one of the things we were talking about is building on the momentum from House Bill 3 so we could better align our higher ed finance systems with our goals for higher education. Now, I think that's gonna take longer. I think it's going to be now a multi-session kind of prospect. But particularly if we think about what we've learned from and take inspiration from the work around House Bill 3 in aligning the finance system with students' needs, where HB3 is pretty nuanced. It provides additional funding for concentrations of students in poverty, for example, where on the higher ed side, we make zero adjustment for student need. So when A&M Commerce or Dallas College or any of these institutions enroll a student, let's say an adult learner who's been out of college for a while and is going to need some additional advising and support or wraparound services so they can stay on track and get that credential that we need and they need. Or when they enroll a student direct out of high school that needs to be shored up in certain areas, they get right now $0 to help offset those additional costs. That puts tremendous pressure on the institutions. So I think that's an important area where we can take inspiration from the work in HB3. And my hope, my commitment is that we can inform those conversations over multiple sessions so we can better align our finance systems with our goals.
That's great, Dr. Keller. Thank you so much. This has been outstanding. We can't thank you enough. I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, who will do our best, however, to do so. So, Crystal, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Dr. Keller, thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us in this very important conversation. I did want to say, Dr. Keller, I still remember testifying as a TW college student in Austin in support of higher ed financial aid for first generation students. So thank you so much for all you do. It is so vital for the future of our community and our students here in Texas. And we look forward to future updates and supporting these appropriations efforts. The Chamber, it will be making a donation as a token of our thanks to Dr. Keller and all of our speakers this year to the Austin Street Shelter. And so please, thank you again for joining us. Please don't forget to mark your calendars for our 7th program in this series to be held on Monday, April 19th at 2 p.m. with Texas Tribune's Ross Ramsey. So thank you so much, Jeff. I hope I didn't miss anything. We'll be keeping the lines open if you wish to continue to network. With that, thank you all so much and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Crystal. You did great. And I put a link to sign up for the next program with Ross Ramsey in the chat, so you can sign up for it now. And of course, thanks again to all of our sponsors, AECOM, Bradley, Frost Bank, HDR, HNTB, Jacobs, Encore, Texas Health, Children's Health, Reliant, and Polsinelli. Of course, thanks to Crystal for moderating, and thanks again to Dr. Keller. And look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks for Ross Ramsey. You can sign up now. And otherwise, we'll leave the line open for networking, so please feel free to stick around. And that includes you too, Dr. Keller, if you'd like to stick around.
Thanks. I got to jump off, but I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today.
We enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Keller.